Hey y'all, tonight we're stepping into the marble courtyards and olive groves of ancient Greece, where sexuality wasn't boxed into the neat categories we use today. You're walking barefoot on sun-warmed stone, breathing in the scent of burning incense and Mediterranean herbs, while around you, philosophers debate love with the same intensity they apply to mathematics and politics. The air hums with a different kind of energy, one where physical pleasure, intellectual pursuit, and spiritual connection weren't separate territories, but overlapping realms of human experience. You probably won't survive this journey without questioning everything you thought you knew about ancient morality, because the Greeks had a completely different playbook. Where we see rigid sexual orientations, they saw fluid roles. Where we draw sharp lines between sacred and sensual, they found divine connection through earthly pleasure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from as we explore these ancient mysteries together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a world where being the active partner in any relationship, regardless of gender, marked you as dominant, while being passive suggested submission. This wasn't about gay or straight. It was about power dynamics that flowed through every aspect of Greek society. A wealthy older man pursuing a younger male wasn't seen as homosexual behavior. It was viewed through the lens of social hierarchy, education, and civic responsibility. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this understanding comes from countless legal documents and philosophical texts. Greeks categorized sexual behavior by social role rather than gender preference. Aristotle himself wrote extensively about how sexual relationships reflected broader patterns of dominance and submission that governed everything from politics to household management. But here's a quirky tidbit that might surprise you. Some Greek cities actually had laws requiring men to marry and produce children, regardless of their other romantic preferences. It wasn't about sexual identity. It was about civic duty. You could spend your evenings at symposiums with male lovers and still be expected to fulfill your reproductive obligations to the state. Historians still argue whether this role-based system was more or less restrictive than modern sexual categories. But one thing remains clear. The Greeks approached sexuality with a philosophical complexity that makes our contemporary debates look almost quaint. They weren't asking, "What am I?" but rather, "How does this relationship serve wisdom, beauty, and the good life?" As you settle deeper into this ancient mindset, you're beginning to understand that tonight's journey isn't just about sex. It's about how an entire civilization wove physical pleasure into their understanding of truth, beauty, and human flourishing. You're traveling backward through time now, past the classical Greek cities, past the archaic period, landing on the sun-drenched island of Crete around 2000 BCE. The Minoan civilization spreads before you like a fever dream of sensuality and sophistication that would make later Greeks seem almost prudish by comparison. You're standing in the palace of Knossos, where frescoes of bare-breasted priestesses dance with sacred bulls, their exposed skin not scandalous, but sacred, their bodies celebrating fertility rather than hiding it. The air here feels different, thicker, with incense and sexual energy that permeates every aspect of daily life. You watch Minoan women moving freely through public spaces, their elaborate dresses designed to showcase rather than conceal their breasts, while men wear nothing but loincloths that leave little to imagination. This isn't primitive nudity, it's sophisticated sensuality woven into religious practice and social structure. The mainstream historical fact that archaeologists love to point out is that Minoan art consistently depicts women in positions of religious and social authority, often presiding over rituals where sexuality and spirituality intertwined. These weren't just decorative figures, they were priestesses, goddesses, and political leaders whose exposed bodies symbolized their connection to divine fertility forces. But here's where things get deliciously weird. Some scholars believe the Minoans practiced a form of sacred sexuality where temple rituals included actual sexual acts performed to ensure agricultural fertility. Imagine that, your orgasm literally helping the crops grow. Talk about performance pressure. Though honestly, if your bedroom activities could guarantee a good harvest, wouldn't you feel a certain civic responsibility to really bring your A game? You're witnessing the birth of what would later influence Greek attitudes toward the body and pleasure. The Minoans didn't see sexuality as something to be controlled or hidden. They saw it as a cosmic force that connected humans to the natural world. Their famous snake goddess figurines, with serpents writhing around bare arms and exposed breasts, weren't pornographic. They were religious icons representing the life force that animated everything from earthquakes to childbirth. Historians still argue whether Minoan society was truly matriarchal or simply more gender egalitarian than later civilizations. But the archaeological evidence suggests women held unprecedented power in both religious and secular spheres. Their sexuality wasn't something that belonged to fathers or husbands. It was their own divine connection to cosmic forces. As you wander through these ancient palace corridors, you notice how the Minoans integrated erotic imagery into everyday objects. Drinking cups decorated with coupling figures, jewelry shaped like phalluses and vulvas, wall paintings that celebrate rather than hide human sexuality. This wasn't a civilization that compartmentalized the sacred and sensual. They were part of the same cosmic dance. The influence of this Bronze Age sensuality would ripple forward through centuries, shaping how later Greeks understood the relationship between physical pleasure and spiritual truth. When you remember that crocodile dung contraception we'll encounter later, you'll appreciate how the Minoans' celebration of sexuality as natural and sacred provided the foundation for everything that followed. You're beginning to understand that Greek sexuality didn't emerge in a vacuum. It grew from these ancient roots where bodies were temples, pleasure was prayer, and sexuality was simply another way of participating in the divine order of the universe. You're stepping into the flickering lamplight of an Athenian symposium, where the evening air carries the scent of diluted wine and heated philosophical debate. The andron, the men's dining room, stretches before you with its carefully arranged couches, each designed for two reclining figures who might share more than just conversation before the night ends. You can hear the gentle plucking of a lyre mixing with laughter and the occasional passionate argument about whether love or wisdom deserves greater devotion. These aren't just dinner parties. They're the beating heart of Greek intellectual and sexual culture, where the boundaries between mind and body dissolve like honey in warm wine. You watch as older men recline beside younger companions, their relationships encompassing everything from political mentorship to physical intimacy, while slave boys move between the couches, refilling cups and occasionally catching the wandering hands of symposiums whose inhibitions have melted with the evening's progression. The wine flows in careful ratios, never undiluted, because that would be barbaric, while conversations drift from Homeric poetry to the nature of justice, to the particular beauty of young Alcibiades' thighs. You're witnessing a culture where intellectual discourse and sexual attraction aren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of the same pursuit of beauty and truth. The mainstream historical fact that defines these gatherings comes from countless surviving symposium vessels and literary accounts. These events served as crucial spaces for political networking, philosophical education, and the formation of relationships that would shape Greek society. Plato's Symposium wasn't fiction. It was documentary, capturing how Greeks actually spent their evenings exploring love's mysteries. But here's a delicious detail that might surprise you. Symposiums had strict rules about who could participate and how. Only free adult males were invited as full participants, though Hetairai, those sophisticated courtesans we'll meet later, sometimes joined as entertainment and intellectual companions. The evening followed ritualized patterns, first libations to the gods, then the serious drinking and conversation, finally the komos, a drunken procession through the streets that often ended in someone's bedroom. Think of it as ancient Greek speed dating, but with more philosophy and better wine. You notice how the symposias play kotabus, flicking wine dregs at targets, while declaring their love for various beautiful use. It's like ancient beer pong, except the stakes are romantic reputation, and the conversation between throws covers everything from military strategy to the metaphysics of desire. The winner gets to choose the next topic of discussion or claim a kiss from their favorite companion. Historians still argue whether symposiums were primarily educational institutions or elaborate excuses for sexual networking, but the evidence suggests they were both simultaneously. These gatherings created the social framework where older men formed relationships with younger ones that combined mentorship, friendship, and physical intimacy in ways that would seem impossible to categorize today. As the evening progresses, You watch conversations grow more intimate, hands wander more freely, and the philosophical discussions take on increasingly personal dimensions. Someone quotes Sappho's poetry about desire burning under the skin, while another symposiast argues that physical beauty is just the first step on the ladder toward understanding divine truth. Remember those Minoan foundations of sacred sexuality? Here you see how they evolved into something more intellectual, but equally integrated. A culture where pursuing wisdom and pursuing pleasure weren't contradictory goals, but different paths up the same mountain. You're now witnessing the most controversial aspect of Greek sexuality, the formalized relationships between older men and adolescent boys that formed the backbone of aristocratic education. The gymnasium spreads before you, filled with naked young men training their bodies while their minds absorb lessons from devoted mentors. The scent of olive oil and sweat mingles with the sound of philosophical discussion, creating an atmosphere where physical and intellectual development intertwined in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. This isn't the predatory abuse that the word pederasty conjures today. You're observing a highly regulated system where wealthy older men, Erastes, formed educational partnerships with boys around 14 to 18, eromenos, that combined mentorship, friendship, and carefully controlled physical intimacy. The older partner provided education, social connections, and guidance into adult citizenship, while the younger received the cultural capital necessary for success in Greek society. You watch as Critias instructs young Charmides in rhetoric while their bodies press close during wrestling practice, the educational and erotic elements so thoroughly integrated that separating them would be like trying to separate wine from water in a symposium cup. The relationship follows strict social protocols. The Erastes pursues, the Eromenos remains modest and selective, and the entire community watches to ensure the partnership serves educational rather than purely sexual purposes. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this practice comes from legal speeches and philosophical texts. Pederasty was considered essential for transmitting aristocratic values and preparing young men for citizenship. Aeschines' speech against Timarchus provides detailed evidence of how Athenian law distinguished between honorable pederastic relationships and prostitution, showing how seriously Greeks took these educational partnerships. But here's where things get fascinatingly complex. The Eromenos was expected to never show sexual enthusiasm, only gradual affection and gratitude. Too much eagerness suggested mercenary motives, while too little suggested ingratitude. Imagine being a teenager trying to navigate that emotional minefield. I must appear grateful, but not eager, affectionate, but not lustful, educated, but not calculating. Talk about performance anxiety with a classical education twist. You notice how these relationships operated within strict time limits. Once the Eromenos grew a full beard and reached adulthood, the sexual component was expected to end, though the friendship and mentorship often continued for life. The goal wasn't to create permanent same-sex partnerships, but to prepare young men for their eventual roles as husbands, fathers, and citizens who would themselves become Erastes to the next generation. Historians still argue whether Pederasty was primarily educational or sexual in motivation, but the evidence suggests it served multiple functions simultaneously, transmitting cultural knowledge, creating political alliances between families, and providing emotional and physical intimacy within acceptable social frameworks. As you observe these relationships, you begin to understand how they shaped Greek concepts of masculinity and citizenship. The Erastes learned responsibility and self-control, while the Eromenos absorbed not just academic knowledge, but the subtle social codes that governed aristocratic behavior. These weren't casual hookups, they were formalized apprenticeships in how to be a proper Greek gentleman. Remember those symposium gatherings where philosophy and sexuality intertwined? Here you see their educational foundation, where young men learn to appreciate beauty, engage in intellectual discourse, and navigate complex social relationships that would serve them throughout their adult lives. The system had its critics even in ancient times. Aristophanes mocked it in his comedies, and some philosophers questioned whether it truly served educational purposes. But it remained central to Greek aristocratic culture for centuries. You're walking through the agora of classical Athens, where the legal contradictions around sexuality create a maze more complex than the labyrinth that held the Minotaur. The same city that celebrated pederastic relationships in symposiums also maintained laws that could strip a man of his citizenship for accepting money for sexual services. You're navigating a society where the line between honorable and shameful sexual behavior shifted like shadows at different times of day. The legal landscape spreads before you like a patchwork of permissions and prohibitions that would make modern lawmakers dizzy. Athenian law distinguished carefully between different types of sexual relationships, creating categories that protected some behaviors while criminalizing others based on subtle distinctions of money, age, consent, and social status. You watch as citizens navigate these rules with the careful attention of tightrope walkers, knowing that one misstep could cost them their political rights. Here's where the contradictions become deliciously absurd. The same young man who could honorably receive gifts, education, and affection from an older Erastes could lose his citizenship forever if prosecutors proved he'd accepted direct payment for sexual services. The difference between a legitimate pederastic relationship and prostitution often came down to whether money changed hands explicitly or was disguised as gifts and educational support. The mainstream historical fact that illuminates this complexity comes from Aeschines' prosecution of Timarchus, where detailed legal arguments reveal how Athenian courts evaluated sexual behavior. The case shows that Athens had specific laws, the graphe Hetairai, that allowed citizens to prosecute men who had allegedly prostituted themselves, stripping them of rights to speak in the assembly or hold public office. But here's a quirky legal loophole that shows how seriously Greeks took these distinctions. A man could avoid prosecution for prostitution by claiming his sexual relationships were motivated by love rather than money. Imagine that court defense. Your Honor, I wasn't selling my body. I was just really, really attracted to all those older wealthy men who happened to shower me with expensive gifts. The legal system actually required prosecutors to prove mercenary intent rather than just sexual activity. You observe how these laws created a parallel economy of desire where the same physical acts carried completely different legal and social consequences depending on their framing. A symposium wherein Orestes lavished attention and gifts on his eromenos was celebrated culture. A brothel where clients paid directly for similar services was criminal commerce. The legal complexity extended to citizenship itself. Only free-born Athenian males could participate in honorable pederastic relationships, while slaves and foreigners occupied different categories entirely. You watch as the law creates hierarchies of sexual legitimacy that mirror broader social stratification, where your birth status determined not just your political rights, but your sexual possibilities. Historians still argue whether these laws were regularly enforced or primarily existed as political weapons for attacking enemies, but court speeches suggest they were taken seriously enough to destroy careers and reputations. The threat of prosecution shaped how men conducted their relationships and presented themselves in public. As you witness these legal gymnastics, you begin to understand how Athenian society tried to preserve the educational and cultural benefits of pederasty while preventing what they saw as its corruption into mere commerce. The laws attempted to maintain the fiction that these relationships were about love and learning rather than transaction and pleasure. Remember those symposium rules about proper behavior? Here you see their legal enforcement, where the state itself became invested in policing the boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable forms of desire, creating a system where sexuality was simultaneously celebrated and regulated with Byzantine complexity. You're marching into Sparta, and the first thing that hits you is how different the sexual atmosphere feels from Athens, where Athenian symposiums buzzed with pederastic romance and philosophical seduction. Spartan barracks echo with a more pragmatic approach to human relationships. The famous warrior society that produced the 300 at Thermopylae actually discouraged the very pederastic practices that other Greek cities celebrated as essential to proper education. The dusty training grounds stretch before you, filled with young Spartan warriors whose relationships with older mentors focus intensely on military prowess rather than romantic attachment. You're witnessing a society that took the educational aspects of Greek pederasty while deliberately minimizing its sexual components, creating a system where physical intimacy between males was tolerated but not idealized. Spartan law and custom created what you might call pederasty light. Older warriors did form bonds with younger ones, but these relationships emphasized martial training, physical endurance, and loyalty to the state rather than the intellectual and erotic sophistication prized in Athens. You watch as these partnerships unfold with military efficiency, where emotional attachment that might interfere with battlefield effectiveness was actively discouraged. The mainstream historical fact that separates Sparta from other Greek cities comes from Xenophon's detailed accounts of Spartan customs. While other cities celebrated the lover-beloved relationship as culturally essential, Sparta's laws actually punished older men who formed overly intimate bonds with younger warriors. The state prioritized military effectiveness over romantic education. But here's where Spartan sexual culture gets genuinely weird. They had institutionalized wife-sharing arrangements that would make modern swingers blush. Older men were encouraged to lend their wives to younger, more virile warriors to produce stronger children, while women who bore multiple children to different fathers received public honors. Imagine explaining in that family tree at a reunion, "Well, my father was Cleomenes, but my biological father was actually his friend Brasidas, and my mother was married to both of them at different times for eugenic purposes." You notice how this pragmatic approach to reproduction extended to marriage customs that prioritize genetic fitness over romantic attachment. Spartan women married later than their counterparts elsewhere in Greece, often in their 20s rather than early teens, and maintained unusual freedom to divorce and remarry if their unions proved unproductive. The contrast with Athenian sexual complexity becomes stark as you observe Spartan simplicity. Where Athens created elaborate legal distinctions between honorable and shameful relationships, Sparta simply asked whether sexual behavior served the state's military needs. Pederasty that distracted warriors from training was discouraged. Marriages that produced strong soldiers were celebrated regardless of emotional content. Historians still argue whether Spartan sexual restraint reflected genuine moral conservatism or simply military pragmatism, but the evidence suggests they viewed sexuality primarily as a tool for producing and training effective warriors rather than as a path to philosophical enlightenment or cultural refinement. As you witness these differences, you begin to understand how Greek sexual practices varied dramatically between city-states, each adapting common cultural elements to serve their particular social priorities. Sparta took the Greek emphasis on male bonding and mentorship while stripping away the romantic idealization that characterized Athenian pederasty. Remember those Athenian legal complexities around sexual behavior? Here you see their opposite, a society that simplified sexual regulation by subordinating all personal relationships to military effectiveness, creating a culture where your romantic life was literally a matter of state security. The Spartan approach reveals how the same basic Greek cultural materials could be shaped into radically different systems depending on social priorities and values. You're stepping into the perfumed chambers of Aspasia, the most famous Hetairai in Athens, where intelligence and sensuality combine in ways that would make modern dating apps weep with envy. These aren't ordinary prostitutes. you're meeting the intellectual courtesans who wielded influence over politicians, philosophers, and generals through a potent combination of wit, education, and sexual sophistication that respectable wives were never allowed to develop. The distinction hits you immediately. While citizen wives remained secluded in their homes, managing households and producing legitimate heirs, Hetairai moved freely through male society, attending symposiums, engaging in philosophical debates, and forming relationships that shaped Athenian politics. You watch Aspasia herself, holding court with Pericles, Socrates, and other luminaries, her opinions on rhetoric and politics carrying weight that no respectable married woman could ever claim. These women occupied a unique social category that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. Educated, independent, and sexually autonomous in ways that challenged every assumption about female capabilities. You observe how they've mastered not just the arts of physical pleasure, but also music, poetry, rhetoric, and philosophy, making them more intellectually stimulating companions than the sheltered daughters of citizens who married young and remained largely uneducated. The mainstream historical fact that defines Hetairai comes from countless references in comedy, philosophy, and legal speeches. These women operated as a parallel elite class, often accumulating significant wealth and influence while remaining outside the formal structures of citizenship and marriage. Demosthenes famously distinguished them from wives and concubines, noting that we have Hetairai for pleasure, concubines for daily care, and wives for producing legitimate children. But here's where their situation becomes fascinatingly complex. Many Hetairai were foreigners or freed slaves who couldn't legally marry Athenian citizens anyway, so they created alternative paths to social influence through their intellectual and sexual skills. Some accumulated enough wealth to dedicate expensive offerings to the gods, while others like Neaira, whose legal case provides detailed evidence of Hetaira life, attempted to pass their daughters off as legitimate citizens. Talk about ancient social climbing with a PhD in seduction. You notice how Hetairai developed their own economic networks, often supporting each other and investing in property, slaves, and luxury goods that displayed their success. Unlike wives, who depended entirely on their husband's resources, these women controlled their own finances and could choose their clients based on personal preference as well as profit. The educational aspect sets them apart from simple prostitution. Hetairai studied with philosophers, learned to play musical instruments, memorized poetry, and developed conversational skills that made them sought-after companions for intellectual as well as physical intimacy. You watch as they navigate symposium conversations with ease, quoting Homer while flirting, discussing politics while seducing. Historians still argue whether Hetairai represented female liberation or simply a different form of exploitation, but their own voices, preserved in fragments and legal cases, suggest many viewed their independence as preferable to the restrictions of traditional marriage. As you observe these remarkable women, you begin to understand how they carved out space for female agency within a society that otherwise offered women few choices. Their sexuality became a tool for accessing education, influence, and economic independence that respectable wives could never achieve. Remember those Spartan marriage arrangements that prioritized state needs over personal choice? Here you see the opposite. Women who used their sexual autonomy to create lives of intellectual and economic freedom, though always at the cost of social respectability and legal protection. The Hetairai reveal how sexuality could become a pathway to power for those clever and bold enough to navigate its dangers. You're approaching the temple of Aphrodite at Corinth, where the line between worship and sexuality dissolves into something that would scandalize modern religious sensibilities while making perfect sense to ancient Greek theology. The marble steps beneath your feet have been worn smooth by thousands of pilgrims who came seeking divine favor through acts that combine spiritual devotion with physical pleasure. You're entering a world where sacred prostitution wasn't a contradiction in terms, but a logical expression of how sexuality connected mortals to cosmic forces. The temple complex spreads before you like a religious resort where over 1,000 sacred prostitutes, both male and female, served worshippers who believed sexual union could channel divine energy. You watch as sailors fresh from dangerous voyages offer prayers and coins to Aphrodite through intimate encounters with her temple servants, their gratitude for safe passage expressed through acts that honored the goddess of love while satisfying very human needs. This isn't the seedy commercialization that sacred prostitution might suggest to modern minds. You're witnessing a sophisticated theological system where sexuality served as a form of prayer, a way of participating in the creative forces that governed fertility, prosperity, and protection. The temple prostitutes weren't exploited victims, but religious functionaries whose sexual services generated revenue for maintaining the goddess's cult while providing worshippers with direct access to divine power. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this practice comes from Strabo's detailed description of Corinthian temple prostitution, where he notes that the temple of Aphrodite employed over 1,000 sacred prostitutes whose services made Corinth wealthy and famous throughout the Mediterranean. The city's prosperity was literally built on the intersection of commerce, religion, and sexuality. But here's where the practice gets deliciously complicated. Different temples had different rules about who could serve as sacred prostitutes and under what circumstances. Some required temporary service from citizen daughters as part of religious festivals, while others employed permanent temple slaves dedicated to the goddess from childhood. Imagine the career counseling sessions. Well, honey, you could become a priestess and tend the sacred flame, or you could serve Aphrodite more directly. Both paths lead to divine service, just with different job requirements. You notice how these arrangements created complex economies where sexual services, religious devotion, and civic prosperity intertwined in ways that made moral judgments nearly impossible. The same act that generated temple revenue also honored the goddess, satisfied worshippers' needs, and contributed to the city's reputation as a center of Aphrodite's power. The theological logic becomes clearer as you observe the rituals. Aphrodite governed not just romantic love, but also the fertility of crops, the success of trade ventures, and the protection of travelers. Sexual union with her temple servants allowed worshippers to tap into these divine powers directly, making their offerings more effective than simple prayers or sacrifices. Historians still argue whether sacred prostitution was as widespread as ancient sources suggest, or whether later Christian writers exaggerated its prevalence to discredit pagan religion. But archaeological evidence from multiple sites confirms that sexuality and worship were integrated in ways that modern religions find difficult to comprehend. As you witness these sacred transactions, you begin to understand how Greeks saw sexuality as a cosmic force rather than a private pleasure. The temple prostitutes weren't selling their bodies. They were channeling divine energy through physical union, making every encounter a form of communion between human and divine realms. Remember those Hetairai who used sexuality to gain intellectual and economic independence? Here you see sexuality serving even higher purposes, where physical pleasure becomes a pathway to divine favor and cosmic harmony. You're standing in the sacred grove of Aphrodite on Cyprus, where the goddess of love first emerged from sea foam according to myth, and where her temples became centers of sexual worship that drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. The air shimmers with incense and sexual energy as you witness how the Greeks understood divine sexuality not as metaphor, but as literal cosmic force that governed everything from personal attraction to the fertility of entire civilizations. The temple complex before you pulses with activity that seamlessly blends the sacred and sensual. Priests and priestesses performing rituals that celebrate sexuality as divine gift rather than human weakness. You watch as worshippers offer prayers for successful marriages, fertile harvests, and protection during childbirth. Their petitions accompanied by acts of physical intimacy that honor Aphrodite's dominion over all forms of creative union. These aren't primitive fertility cults, but sophisticated theological systems where sexuality served as a bridge between mortal and divine realms. You observe how Aphrodite's worship incorporated everything from simple prayers for romantic success to elaborate festivals where entire communities celebrated the life-giving power of sexual union through ritualized acts that would make modern religious leaders faint with horror. The mainstream historical fact that defines Aphrodite's cult comes from archaeological evidence across dozens of temple sites. Her worship consistently involved sexual imagery, phallic symbols, and rituals that celebrated rather than suppressed human sexuality. From Cyprus to Corinth to Cythera, her temples served as centers where physical pleasure and spiritual devotion merged into unified practice. But here's where Aphrodite's theology gets genuinely mind-bending. She wasn't just the goddess of romantic love, but of all creative forces in the universe. Her sexual energy was believed to animate everything from the attraction between atoms to the movement of celestial bodies. Ancient hymns describe her as the force that brings together male and female of every species, making her cosmic sexuality the fundamental principle that keeps existence from collapsing into chaos. Talk about performance pressure. Your love life was literally helping maintain universal order. You notice how different aspects of Aphrodite governed different types of sexual experience. Aphrodite, Pandemos, oversaw common physical attraction, while Aphrodite, Urania, presided over elevated spiritual love. This wasn't moral hierarchy, but recognition that sexuality operated on multiple levels simultaneously, from basic biological urges to transcendent mystical experiences. The goddess's own mythology reveals how Greeks understood sexuality as inherently divine. Her birth from sea foam, her marriage to Hephaestus, while conducting affairs with Ares, her role in starting the Trojan War through Helen's beauty. These weren't moral failings, but demonstrations of how sexual energy operates beyond human attempts to control or categorize it. Historians still argue whether Aphrodite's sexual worship represented genuine religious experience or elaborate justification for physical pleasure, but the consistency of her cult practices across centuries suggests Greeks found authentic spiritual meaning in celebrating sexuality as divine gift. As you witness these sacred celebrations, you begin to understand how Greeks avoided the mind-body dualism that would later characterize Christian thought. For them, physical pleasure wasn't opposed to spiritual truth, but was one of its most direct expressions, making sexuality a form of prayer rather than a distraction from it. Remember those sacred prostitutes who channeled divine energy through physical union? Here you see the theological foundation that made their work not just acceptable, but holy, where serving Aphrodite through sexuality was as legitimate a religious vocation as tending any other divine flame. The goddess's temples reveal how an entire civilization integrated sexuality into their understanding of cosmic order, making physical love a pathway to divine truth rather than an obstacle to spiritual development. You're examining a red figure kylix in an Athenian potter's workshop where the artist's brush captures sexual scenes with the same artistic attention devoted to heroic battles or religious ceremonies. The pottery around you tells stories that respectable literature wouldn't dare record. Explicit images of symposium encounters, mythological seductions, and everyday sexual practices painted with technical skill that reveals how Greeks viewed erotic art as legitimate artistic expression rather than pornographic shame. These aren't hidden treasures locked away from public view. You're witnessing how sexual imagery decorated the cups, plates, and storage vessels that Greeks used daily, making erotic art as common as geometric patterns or mythological scenes. The pottery workshop buzzes with craftsmen who paint coupling figures with the same professional pride they bring to depicting gods and heroes, their work destined for symposiums, homes, and even graves where sexual imagery accompanied the deceased into the afterlife. The artistic sophistication strikes you immediately. These aren't crude graffiti, but carefully composed scenes that demonstrate mastery of human anatomy, emotional expression, and narrative storytelling. You watch as painters capture not just physical acts, but the psychological dynamics of desire, power, and pleasure. Their red and black figures revealing how Greeks understood sexuality as worthy of serious artistic attention. The mainstream historical fact that defines Greek erotic pottery comes from thousands of surviving examples in museums worldwide. Sexual imagery appeared on approximately 10% of all decorated pottery, making it one of the most common artistic themes alongside warfare, athletics, and religious ritual. This wasn't marginal art, but mainstream cultural expression that reveals how ordinary Greeks thought about sexuality. But here's where the pottery gets fascinatingly specific. Different vessel types carry different sexual messages depending on their intended use. Drinking cups often featured scenes that would unfold as wine was consumed, revealing increasingly explicit imagery as the evening progressed, while storage jars depicted more domestic sexual scenarios. Wedding gifts frequently included pottery with fertility imagery, though some pieces were so explicit they'd make modern bachelor party gifts look tame by comparison. Imagine unwrapping your wedding presents and finding a vase decorated with detailed instructions for your honeymoon activities. You notice how the artists encoded social messages within their erotic scenes. Older men pursuing younger ones reflected symposium culture, while images of women in dominant positions might comment on the power dynamics of Hetairai relationships. The pottery served as visual commentary on sexual practices, social relationships, and cultural values that written sources often left implicit. The technical skill required to create these pieces reveals how erotic art demanded the same artistic training as any other subject matter. Painters had to master perspective, proportion, and emotional expression while depicting intimate acts, making their work both sexually explicit and aesthetically sophisticated. Historians still argue whether erotic pottery reflected actual sexual practices or idealized fantasies, but the consistency of certain themes across centuries suggests these images documented real aspects of Greek sexual culture rather than pure imagination. As you examine these artistic treasures, you begin to understand how Greeks integrated sexuality into their visual culture without shame or concealment. The pottery reveals a society comfortable enough with sexual imagery to display it prominently in domestic and social settings. Remember those Aphrodite temples where sexuality served divine purposes? Here you see how that same comfort with sexual themes extended into everyday artistic expression, where erotic imagery enhanced rather than corrupted the aesthetic experience. The pottery workshops reveal how an entire artistic tradition developed around celebrating sexuality as a legitimate subject for serious creative work, making physical pleasure visible in ways that honored rather than degraded human desire. You're stepping into the gardens of Lesbos, where Sappho's voice echoes across centuries with fragments of poetry that capture female desire in ways that male-dominated Greek literature rarely preserved. The island breeze carries whispers of relationships between women that existed parallel to the pederastic culture of mainland Greece, creating spaces where female sexuality could express itself beyond the confines of marriage and reproduction that defined most women's lives. The fragments that survive read like love letters scattered by time. Some say cavalry, others infantry, others ships are the most beautiful thing on earth, but I say it's whatever you love, revealing how women in Sappho's circle experience passion, jealousy, and devotion that transcended the utilitarian marriages arranged by their families. You're witnessing a rare glimpse into female emotional and sexual autonomy that most Greek women never experienced. Sappho's Thiassos, her circle of young women dedicated to music, poetry, and the worship of Aphrodite, created an alternative social space where relationships between females could flourish without male oversight or interference. You watch as these women form bonds that combine intellectual mentorship, emotional intimacy, and physical attraction in patterns that mirror male pederastic relationships while serving distinctly female purposes. The mainstream historical fact that anchors female same-sex relationships comes from Sappho's own poetry and later commentaries. Her work provides the clearest evidence that Greek women formed passionate attachments to each other that were recognized and celebrated within certain social contexts. Her fame as a poet gave legitimacy to relationships that might otherwise have remained invisible in male-dominated historical records. But here's where female sexuality gets deliciously complicated. Most evidence suggests these relationships were temporary, ending when the younger women left to marry and fulfill their reproductive duties to their families. Unlike male pederastic relationships that could continue as lifelong friendships, female same-sex bonds were often interrupted by the social requirement that women produce legitimate heirs. Imagine having to explain to your passionate lover, "Sorry, darling, but my father has arranged my marriage to a man I've never met, so our beautiful relationship has to end so I can spend the rest of my life bearing children for his household." You notice how Sappho's poetry captures the intensity of these temporary relationships, the burning jealousy when a beloved chooses marriage, the physical symptoms of desire that make her tongue break and thin fire runs under skin, the bittersweet knowledge that these connections exist within narrow windows of female freedom before social obligations intervene. The religious context becomes crucial as you observe how these relationships, often centered around worship of Aphrodite and the Muses, giving them sacred legitimacy that protected them from social criticism. Sappho's Thiassos wasn't just a social club, but a religious community where serving the goddesses provided cover for relationships that might otherwise have been questioned. Historians still argue whether Sappho's relationships were primarily emotional or included physical intimacy, but her poetry's erotic intensity suggests these bonds encompassed the full range of human connection that male sources attributed to pederastic relationships. As you listen to these ancient voices, you begin to understand how female sexuality found expression despite social restrictions that limited women's choices and autonomy. The fragments reveal women creating their own spaces for desire, creativity, and emotional fulfillment within a culture that primarily valued them for their reproductive capacity. Remember those Hetairai who used sexuality to gain independence from traditional female roles. Here you see another form of female sexual autonomy, where women found ways to love each other within religious and artistic contexts that provided protection from social disapproval. Sappho's legacy reveals how female desire persisted and flourished even when historical records largely ignored or suppressed women's voices and experiences. You're witnessing the wedding procession of a 14-year-old Athenian girl being delivered to her 30-year-old husband like a carefully negotiated business transaction, while across the city, her older brother continues his passionate affair with a male symposium companion that everyone considers perfectly normal. The contrast reveals how Greek marriage operated in a completely different universe from Greek sexuality, one focused on property, lineage, and civic duty, rather than personal attraction or emotional fulfillment. The bride's father walks beside the cart carrying his daughter and her dowry, both equally important assets being transferred to secure political alliances and economic partnerships between families. You're observing a system where marriage served as the foundation of social order while having almost nothing to do with the romantic and sexual relationships that Greeks actually celebrated in their poetry, philosophy, and art. These arranged unions prioritize compatibility of social status, wealth, and family connections over any consideration of personal chemistry or sexual attraction. You watch as families negotiate marriage contracts that specify dowry amounts, inheritance rights, and the political advantages each household will gain, treating the actual bride and groom as somewhat secondary considerations in arrangements that will shape their entire lives. The mainstream historical fact that defines Greek marriage comes from legal speeches and household management texts. Marriage was primarily an economic and political institution designed to produce legitimate heirs and maintain family property across generations. Xenophon's Oeconomicus provides detailed evidence of how husbands viewed wives as household managers rather than romantic partners, their value measured by efficiency in supervising slaves and producing children. But here's where the system gets ironically twisted. The very social arrangements that made passionate marriage impossible also created the conditions where extramarital sexuality could flourish. Since spouses barely knew each other and married for practical rather than emotional reasons, both partners often sought intellectual stimulation and physical pleasure outside their marriages. The husband might form deep bonds with male lovers or sophisticated Hetairai, while the wife was expected to find fulfillment in managing the household and raising children, though some evidence suggests married women occasionally formed their own networks of emotional and possibly physical intimacy. You notice how this separation of marriage from sexuality created parallel systems of human connection. The official world of legitimate reproduction and property transfer, and the unofficial world of symposiums, pederastic relationships, and Hetairai companionship, where people actually explore desire, intellectual compatibility, and emotional intimacy. The age differences in these marriages reveal another layer of complexity. Girls married shortly after puberty to men often twice their age, creating relationships that resembled father-daughter dynamics more than partnerships between equals. The young wife's primary education came from her husband, who taught her household management skills, while she learned to navigate adult sexuality with someone who was essentially a stranger. Historians still argue whether some Greek marriages developed into genuine partnerships over time, but the literary evidence suggests most couples remained essentially business partners who happened to share a bed for reproductive purposes. As you observe these contrasting systems, you begin to understand how Greeks compartmentalized different aspects of human relationship in ways that seem almost schizophrenic to modern sensibilities. The same culture that produced sublime poetry about love and sophisticated philosophy about desire also maintained marriage practices that treated emotional connection as irrelevant to domestic life. Remember those Sappho fragments about passionate female relationships? Here you see why such connections were often temporary. Marriage interrupted them not because they were disapproved of, but because they belonged to a completely different social category from the practical arrangements that governed adult domestic life. You're ascending Mount Olympus through the mists of mythology, where the gods themselves demonstrate that sexuality isn't bound by mortal rules of fidelity, gender, or even species. Zeus transforms into a swan to seduce Leda, a bull to carry off Europa, and golden rain to impregnate Danae, while his wife Hera plots elaborate revenge schemes that reveal how divine marriage combines cosmic power struggles with very human sexual jealousy. You're witnessing how Greek mythology used divine sexuality to explain everything from seasonal changes to the founding of cities. The pantheon spreads before you like a cosmic soap opera where sexual desire drives the fundamental forces of creation and destruction. You watch as Aphrodite's affair with Ares nearly destroys her marriage to Hephaestus, while their passion generates both love and war across the mortal realm. These aren't moral tales about proper behavior. They're explanations of how sexual energy operates as a creative force that shapes reality itself. The gods' sexual adventures serve as divine precedent for every form of human desire that Greeks encountered in their own lives. Zeus's numerous male and female lovers normalize both heterosexual and homosexual relationships, while stories of divine rape and seduction explore the complex dynamics of power, consent, and desire that mortals struggle to understand in their own relationships. The mainstream historical fact that anchors divine sexuality comes from the consistency of these themes across centuries of Greek literature. From Homer through the tragic poets to Hellenistic writers, divine sexual behavior remained a central mechanism for explaining natural phenomena, political events, and human psychology. The gods' erotic adventures weren't entertainment, but theology. But here's where divine sexuality gets genuinely mind-bending. The gods could change gender, species, and physical form at will, making their sexual experiences transcend every category that limited mortal relationships. Zeus becomes female to seduce mortals. Tiresias experiences life as both man and woman, and various deities transform into animals, objects, or natural phenomena to pursue their desires. Imagine the identity crisis. Well, I started the evening as a male god, became a shower of gold to seduce a princess, then transformed into a bull to escape my wife's jealousy. Tuesday nights on Olympus can get complicated. You notice how these divine transformations suggest that sexuality operates beyond the physical forms that seem to define it. The gods' ability to change bodies while maintaining desire reveals how Greeks understood erotic attraction as fundamentally spiritual rather than merely biological. The creation myths themselves emerge from sexual union. Gaia and Uranus generate the Titans through cosmic intercourse, while chaos gives birth to existence through mysterious reproductive processes that combine sexual and asexual generation. The universe itself results from divine sexuality, making physical desire a participation in the creative forces that brought everything into being. Historians still argue whether these myths reflected actual religious beliefs or served primarily as literary entertainment, but their integration into religious festivals and temple worship suggests Greeks found genuine spiritual meaning in divine sexual stories. As you witness these cosmic dramas, you begin to understand how mythology provided Greeks with a framework for comprehending sexuality as sacred rather than shameful. The gods' erotic adventures demonstrated that desire was a divine gift rather than a human weakness, making physical pleasure a form of participation in cosmic creativity. Remember those Aphrodite temples where sexuality served divine purposes? Here you see the mythological foundation that made such worship logical. If the gods themselves expressed their divinity through sexual desire, then mortals could connect with divine power through their own erotic experiences. The mythological realm reveals how Greeks understood sexuality as a fundamental force of existence rather than a mere biological function or social institution. You're reclining in the Academy Gardens, where Plato transforms the raw material of Greek sexual culture into something approaching mystical philosophy, his voice weaving together the symposium traditions you've witnessed into a ladder of love that ascends from physical attraction to divine contemplation. The same pederastic relationships that produce political scandals and legal prosecutions become, in his hands, stepping stones toward ultimate truth and beauty that transcend the material world entirely. The philosophical revolution unfolds before you as Plato takes the erotic energy that drove symposium culture and redirects it toward intellectual and spiritual goals that would reshape Western thought for millennia. You're witnessing how one brilliant mind transformed Greek sexuality from a social practice into a metaphysical system where physical desire becomes the engine that drives souls toward enlightenment. In the symposium, you listen as various speakers offer competing theories about love's nature and purpose, each building on the sexual culture you've observed throughout your journey. Aristophanes tells his myth of soulmates seeking their other halves, while Pausanias distinguishes between common physical attraction and noble spiritual love. But it's Diotima's speech through Socrates that revolutionizes everything by describing love as a ladder of ascension. The mainstream historical fact that anchors Platonic love comes from the detailed philosophical arguments preserved in multiple dialogues. Plato consistently portrayed physical attraction as the first step in a process that could lead to contemplation of absolute beauty, truth, and goodness. His theory wasn't anti-sexual, but transsexual, using erotic energy as fuel for philosophical inquiry. But here's where Plato's system gets beautifully paradoxical. He validates the intense emotional bonds of pederastic culture while simultaneously arguing that their highest expression requires transcending physical consummation. The perfect lover learns to appreciate his beloved's physical beauty, then his spiritual beauty, then beauty itself as an abstract principle. It's like philosophical blue balls, elevated to cosmic significance. Yes, I desire you intensely, but that desire is actually pointing me toward eternal truths that make physical satisfaction seem trivial by comparison. You notice how this philosophical framework preserves the educational aspects of pederasty while spiritualizing its sexual components. The older lover still guides the younger toward wisdom and virtue, but their relationship serves as a vehicle for mutual ascension toward divine truth rather than mere physical pleasure or social advancement. The latter metaphor becomes crucial as you observe how each rung represents a different level of understanding, from attraction to one beautiful body, to appreciation of all beautiful bodies, to love of beautiful souls, to contemplation of beautiful institutions and laws, to direct apprehension of beauty itself. Each stage uses the energy generated by the previous level while transcending its limitations. Historians still argue whether Plato intended his theory as practical guidance for actual relationships or as purely theoretical philosophy, but his influence on subsequent Western thought about love, sexuality, and spirituality proved enormous regardless of his original intentions. As you witness this philosophical transformation, you begin to understand how Plato created a bridge between Greek sexual culture and the more spiritualized approaches to desire that would characterize later Christian and Islamic thought. His system honored the power of erotic attraction while channeling it toward goals that transcended immediate physical satisfaction. Remember those divine myths where sexuality served as cosmic creative force, here you see how philosophy could transform that same energy into a tool for individual spiritual development, making physical desire the first step in a journey toward ultimate reality. Plato's Academy reveals how the most sophisticated Greek thinkers understood sexuality not as an end in itself, but as a beginning, the spark that could ignite a lifelong quest for wisdom, beauty, and truth. You're standing at the crossroads of history, where Greek sexual culture meets its transformation through Roman adoption and eventual Christian revolution, watching as the Symposium traditions, pederastic education, and sacred sexuality you've witnessed throughout this journey evolve into something recognizable yet fundamentally different. The marble columns of Greek temples cast long shadows across centuries as their sexual freedoms gradually give way to new moral frameworks that would reshape Western civilization's understanding of desire, love, and human relationships. The Roman conquest brings both preservation and transformation as you observe how Roman elites eagerly adopt Greek pederastic practices while simultaneously developing their own distinct sexual culture. Roman symposiums become less philosophical and more hedonistic, while the educational aspects of Greek pederasty often degenerate into mere status display among wealthy families seeking to appear cultured and sophisticated. You watch as Roman law codifies many Greek sexual practices while adding distinctly Roman concerns about citizenship, social hierarchy, and imperial power. The same acts that Greeks evaluated through frameworks of education and beauty become, in Roman hands, markers of social dominance and political control that reflect the empire's broader authoritarian tendencies. The mainstream historical fact that defines this transition comes from legal codes, literary works, and archaeological evidence spanning several centuries. Roman culture preserved many Greek sexual practices while gradually embedding them within different social and moral frameworks that emphasize power, status, and imperial identity rather than philosophical enlightenment or religious devotion. But here's where the transformation becomes fascinatingly complex. Early Christian communities emerge within this Greco-Roman sexual landscape, initially adopting some Greek philosophical approaches to desire, while developing radically different theological frameworks that would eventually revolutionize Western sexuality. The same Platonic ladder of love that elevated physical attraction towards spiritual contemplation becomes, in Christian hands, a rejection of physical pleasure in favor of purely spiritual devotion. Talk about philosophical evolution with a plot twist that nobody saw coming. You notice how Christian writers like Augustine struggled with their own sexual desires while developing theological systems that portrayed physical pleasure as fundamentally corrupting rather than potentially enlightening. The Greek integration of sexuality and spirituality gradually gives way to a dualistic framework that sees body and soul as opposing rather than complementary aspects of human nature. The transformation accelerates as Christianity gains imperial support, with laws increasingly restricting the sexual freedoms that Greeks had taken for granted. Pederasty becomes criminalized, sacred prostitution is banned, and the symposium culture that had nurtured both intellectual and sexual exploration disappears under pressure from Christian moral reform. Historians still argue whether this transformation represented moral progress or cultural loss, but the evidence suggests that Western civilization lost something irreplaceable when it abandoned the Greek integration of sexuality, philosophy, and spiritual development in favor of more dualistic approaches that separated physical and spiritual aspects of human experience. As you witness this historical pivot, you begin to understand how the Greek sexual culture you've explored throughout this journey represents not just ancient history, but an alternative vision of how human societies might organize relationships between desire, education, spirituality, and social order. Their approach wasn't perfect. It excluded women, depended on slavery, and often reflected problematic power dynamics, but it offered possibilities for integrating sexuality into human flourishing that subsequent cultures largely abandoned. Remember those Minoan foundations where exposed breasts symbolize sacred fertility? The journey comes full circle as you recognize how that ancient comfort with sexuality as divine gift gradually transformed into the sexual anxieties and restrictions that would characterize Western culture for the next 2 millennia. The legacy endures in fragments: Platonic love, symposium traditions, and philosophical approaches to desire that continue influencing how we think about relationships, education, and the connection between physical and spiritual aspects of human experience. Greek sexual culture offers not a model to copy, but a mirror for examining our own assumptions about desire, love, and the possibilities for human flourishing. As the shadows lengthen and this ancient world fades into memory, you carry with you a deeper understanding of how one remarkable civilization approached the eternal human challenge of integrating sexuality into the larger project of living well, loving wisely, and seeking truth through every aspect of human experience. The marble grows cool beneath your feet as twilight settles over these ancient landscapes, and you find yourself drifting towards sleep with images of symposiums and sacred groves, philosophical conversations, and divine mysteries, all woven together in a tapestry of human desire that honored both body and soul as pathways toward understanding the deepest truths about love, beauty, and the meaning of existence itself. The gentle rhythm of your breathing slows as you release the day's tensions and allow these ancient wisdoms to settle into your dreams, where Greek voices whisper across centuries about the eternal dance between desire and wisdom, pleasure and truth, human longing and divine mystery that continues in every heart that seeks to love well and live fully.